Hello and welcome. I'm going to be taking an extended break from Albion Online as my last upload for some time. I decided to put together a complete video guide about everything I learned over the past year or so of doing Avalonian dungeons. Now, there's a text written guide as well that I highly recommend you check out. Now, I need to throw out a lot of caveats before we start. There are a lot of different ways that work for doing avas, and some of them work better depending on what your group is more comfortable with. Now, just some general information about the dungeons themselves. They can spawn naturally in Tier 6, Tier 7, and Tier 8 black zones. There can be up to 3 dungeons in a zone at any given time. They can also appear in the mists of Avalon in these static dungeon entrances. Be careful though, if you walk inside and then leave it, it will despawn after 5 minutes. And once it despawns, from my experience, it takes somewhere between 4 to 7 hours until they respawn. Most people, however, make use of the large group dungeon maps that you can find on the market. When using one of these maps, keep in mind that it can spawn up to 3 zones away from the place where you use the map. A very useful trick to keep in mind is you can make use of static dungeon locations in the black zones to reduce the amount of zones it can spawn in. Avas can have either 1 or 2 floors, and they have a very predictable pattern in terms of their layout. You have the starting mob pack, and after that you will find what I call a connector. This leads to a boss area and then the boss room. And after each boss you have a gate. After the gate you either find another connector that leads to another boss area and then etc., or a short connector that leads you to the second floor. You basically run into this connector, boss area, gate, connector, boss area, gate pattern until you run into the final boss connector and then the final boss. Both of which are always the same for every single Avalonian dungeon you will ever do. Each floor can only have a particular boss appear once, but you can run into the same boss twice if you run into it again on the second floor. Different connectors vary in difficulty, and I started compiling some of them in the text guide with videos showing tips how to clear certain connectors and boss room areas, but the list is very short as I didn't get far with it. Hopefully the few videos here will be of benefit, even if they are a little outdated though. Each boss guards either 1 purple, 2 purple, 1 golden, or 2 golden chests. The exception to this is the final boss through Bedivere, which always contains at least 2 purple chests. You can see the track statistics and percentages of getting each chest right here on the screen. Over 100 runs tracked is a somewhat decent sample size to give you a rough idea of the distribution. Obviously, there's a lot of runs I didn't track, but yeah, it's still a good enough sample size, I think. Obviously, at the end of each Avalonian dungeon, you will find the Grail, which gives you a week-long buff called Ascension that increases PvE fame gained by 10%. I highly recommend that you spare enough time for one of these runs. If you're going out for the first time, I suggest having 3 hours spare from the time you start massing until the time you come back to town, because you can have anywhere from 3 up to 7 bosses, and which connectors you get is complete RNG. You don't know if you will finish the dungeon in 40 minutes or if you will sit there for almost 2 hours. Add on the massing time and traveling time, and if you have people who are trying to dive you, etc., you can see avas can take a while from start to finish, but they can also be pretty quick. And if you're going out for the first time, you might get stuck on a boss, and in general, it will take a little longer, so it's good to have some extra time. If you're interested in the bestiary and want to learn about each mob and their abilities, that is in the text version of the guide. Now let's cover the party composition. So while I will recommend going with a full party of 20, you can clear it with a lot less depending on the tier of the dungeon. But for the sake of this video, I will cover what I consider to be the optimal composition based on our strategies. As always, you can find the builds in the guide or in the description below. Let's just show the builds and I'll explain the choices and my reasoning once we have the full picture. We have 2 tanks, 1 incubus tank, which is responsible for shrinking mobs, absorbing damage, and starting any difficult pulls. Now already a lot of people will question the choice of snare charge, but I'll cover that in just a bit. The incubus tank will also be the one to tank bosses in order to reduce the amount of swaps necessary. But make sure to not incubus E or taunt during the Great Arcane while clearing mobs, otherwise it will not work. The second tank is the hammer tank, and is usually the role that the raid leader will play, as it's a comfortable one-dimensional brain-dead role, and once you learn the rotation, you can focus on what the rest of your party is doing and how the pool is going. For bosses, you swap to Black Monk staff and help out as the damage reducing support, basically. As for the healers, we have the main healer, which is the person responsible for healing the Incubus tank during bosses and also during mob clearing, of course. Pretty self-explanatory. As I haven't played this role in months, I can't tell you what the best setup is, but any of the one-handed holies with a sensor works. You could even run Divine if you know what you're doing. Honestly, all depends on your skill as a healer. No matter which one you run, you should not have issues with your healing output. Next, we have two group healers, which use Fallen for bosses to keep the group healthy, and for mob clearing, use Iron Root plus Mistcaller, because let's face it, if you have a competent party, group healers will stand there and just auto the mobs, so they might as well do something useful instead, so bring Iron Roots. Energy pots are recommended, and especially for Sir Bedivere, because you might run out of energy. For certain bosses, knowing when to drop your reset is really good, and I'll mention that later when we go over each boss, but in general, don't be dumb and make sure you use your Q off cooldown on whoever needs it, except the tank, of course. Focus on staying alive and don't give the main tank healing sickness, please. For mob clearing, as Iron Root, try to get used to always linking the two strongest mobs, the two biggest mobs. Accidentally linking a player to a mob is the biggest sin possible, so keep that in mind. For the W, one of the group healers can go with Protection of Nature and slap it on the tank before the pull starts. The other one can go Cleanse just for utility in case it's needed. And before I forget, the biggest thing as a healer is to not cast anything if there are archers in the pull. Make sure they are stunned before you do so, because they will target you with their silence shot otherwise. If your raid leader is nice, they will tell you in advance as the pull starts if there are archers in the specific pull, in case it's not visible or already obvious. But in case you do mess up, make sure to use your roll shoes to get out, and if you fail, then you have a cleanse anyway. As for the Guardian helmets, the flat 4 is intended as flat 4 because it generates a lot of threat from the tank during Sir Bedivere, especially if they are an inexperienced tank and have trouble keeping aggro. Honestly, there's no point in bringing an expensive one anyway, so just bring a flat 4 and you can trash it afterwards. Next, for the supports, let's cover the arcanes first. We have the Great Arcane, which is an important part of the stun rotation, which we'll cover later in more detail. But other than that, just Q whoever seems to need it and frazzle the biggest mob. Make sure you're not stuck in the frazzle animation though, and you have to be there when the stun is needed. A deeper understanding of the stun rotation helps here. For bosses, you're basically a damage reduction bot. Just slap on the Black Monk. As for the cape, it honestly doesn't matter which cape you go, so might as well go Fed for cape for more damage, or demon cape. The raid leader will call for when to drop the damage reduction if you don't know. So, but if you don't know, then ask in advance. For the one-handed arcane, once again, it's an important part of the stun rotation, and the specifics of that will be explained in just a moment. But besides using the E when necessary, you will also frazzle the biggest mob. Drop Jury Armor when you think it's needed, Q whoever seems to need it, and yeah, pretty easy roll, at least with mob clearing. For bosses, one could argue whether you need Enigmatic for most bosses, that it's only really useful during the final boss and High Priestess, but hey, you have it as a swap, might as well use it because it's more useful than the one-handed arcane. For Sir Bedivere, it's recommended to bring a clerical swap, as in case you get grasped by the boss with the big beam thing, you can't shield yourself, and for high tier runs, that thing really hurts. The Mercenary Hood might seem odd, but I'll explain the reasoning for it when we reach the bosses which require that swap. Next, we have the non-arcane supports. First, we have the Iron Root support, which you might think looks awfully similar to the healer build, but it's different enough that it gets its own build. Don't question it. For mob clearing, it's simple. Just link mobs together. That's your only job. For most cases, you can slap on a bow and be useful with applying the resistance shred and decent DPS output along the supportive druid Common Royal Jacket. But this is for bosses, so if your party is inexperienced, I recommend the Fallen Staff instead, specifically for reawakening people who are trolling. Also, having one additional healer will definitely help if your party is struggling, whether it's Archmage, Basilisk, or Sir Bedivere. If you're doing, say, an 8-3 Avalonian dungeon and everyone isn't on point, it's very useful to have an extra healer and a reawaken to ensure you don't have to leash and retry a boss in case someone messes up. Next, we got the Shadow Color support. Your job is to pierce the mobs and reduce their resistances. I see some raid leaders have a life curse swap, but honestly, it is super unnecessary. In my opinion, better to just kill the boss faster. Make sure you don't use your pierces if the mobs are stunned by the Great Arcane E, as the pierce will not apply. If you have a massive brain, you can use your pierce right as the Great Arcane E is landing. Don't do this unless you're experienced though. For bosses, it's the same, you're just a pure spot. Since you never get in melee range anyway, bring Druid Calphurser, Bedivere, and Basilisk to be more useful. Next, we got a Realm Breaker support. Similar job to that of the Shadow Color. You are there for the powerful E ability, and since you're melee, you might as well use Cultist Sandals and be even more useful. Make sure to not use your E during the Great Arcane E, as I mentioned, it will not do anything. Also be mindful of the fact that your E will knock back certain mobs a little bit. If you're inexperienced, I recommend asking the raid leader to call which direction to Realm Breaker from. Keep in mind that you're not a DPS, so as a support, prioritize applying the important debuffs, same as if you're playing Shadow Color. One unique thing about the Realm Breaker role is that if you're doing High Priestess the intended way, you will be the Shadow Picker, but more on that once we get to the boss itself. Otherwise, just pop Royal Armor and help your party with energy, especially the melees. That is all for the supports, healers, and tanks. What we have left is 10 DPS spots, and let me cover those now. So for the DPS spots, as of the time of me making this video, we got Fire, Frost, Crossbow, and Spectre Jacket DPS as the top DPS builds. But as you'll see, we will limit Fire and Spectre to only one per party. Spectre Jacket is a tricky role to play, and there might be times where you'll be forced to turn your jacket off early. There are a lot of things you can play here, from axes to spears to daggers, but the optimal setup, from what I understand, is a Daybreaker and a Crypt Candle with a one-handed dagger swap for bosses. Pretty straightforward way to play though. As the pull is starting, use the inner focus, pop jacket and E into the mobs and try to not kill yourself. Of course, use Shoes of Tenacity to reset aggro, just in case, as you'll be low and might pull aggro from one or two mobs. Next is Fire DPS, and while you could do some finicky stuff, I suggest this build which has strong AoE damage for mob clearing, and then you swap to single target DPS for bosses. You could also run Dawn Song or Great Fire. Now the reason we put a max 1 fire per party is because, first of all, Blazing E doesn't stack. Fair enough, but more importantly, the AoE Q doesn't stack, so we just limit it to 1. Doing the math at same IP, Great Fire is strictly better for bosses, while Blazing is better for mob clearing if you can have it up for every single pull, which is not always the case. Next, we got the DPS, which you can bring however many you want. In my groups, we usually have an even split of both, and these are Frost and Light Crossbow. Frost is pretty straightforward. You pop your buffs, and then you spam your Q. That's pretty self-explanatory. You can go Blink W if you're new to avas until you get the hang of it, but the Bomb W is considered the best for DPS. You can honestly use any Frost you want if you know what you're doing though. I will highly advise against using Chill Hell though, as the E is a pain in the ass and you will troll people with it. Please don't use it. From what I saw, you can also use Scholar Robe and hit very high DPS numbers, so you can go that instead of the Druid Robe as well. As for Light Crossbow, Royal Robe is not a bad substitute, but we generally already have enough of those in the party, so I just slap on a Druid Robe instead. But don't get me wrong, Royal Robe is nice if you spread those out. Not much to say though, except to learn and practice the Q rotation for crossbow. I highly recommend using the Carlion Cape. It's harder to master for sure, as that's an extra thing you have to keep in mind, but it's worth it. Otherwise, just slap on a Demon Cape and do the double Qs. It's really strong still, so yeah, so those are the meta builds, but as I mentioned, it depends on the overall composition. If you lack Royal Robes, then obviously having a few of those on the light crossbows would be ideal. Anyway, let me just quickly mention the low tier off-meta DPS builds. I will warn you to be careful about bringing this to any raid. I usually allow up to 3 of these when doing low tier runs. So 7.1, 7.2, 8.0, 8.1. You can have a few people leeching. It's not really that big of a deal because it's a low tier anyway. It is pretty bad, but it is good enough. So if you have newer players who can't play anything else besides these things, or people who just want to spec things up, it's fine to have a few people who leech. They will obviously have lower DPS, but it's okay because it's a low tier run anyway. Alright, so before we go over and discuss the composition, let me go over the stun rotation first. You start by pulling the mobs, clumping them up with the inertia ring if needed, and then Great Arcane them. People ramp up their Druid and Royal Robes during this time, and then right as Great Arcane stuns, right as the Great Arcane stun ends, you use the one-handed hammer stun to stun the mobs. It's right at this time as all the resistance shred lands with the Incubus E, the Realmbreaker E, Shadowcaller E, Armor Piercer, all of it, and the big damage comes in during this part. Then, right before the hammer stun ends, you use the one-handed Arcane E to AoE silence the mobs, snare charge the mobs, and also use Enfeeble Aura to ensure the mobs do as little damage as possible with their auto attacks. If the mobs are alive, you can do the same thing again, follow up with a Great Arcane right before the silence ends, and then hammer stun again. The mobs should be 100% dead by this point, and if they are not, then either the pull itself was off and mobs weren't clumped properly, or your DPS and supports are not doing their job properly. Perhaps the Incubus hit during the Great Arcane, or you have DPS who are slacking off and don't know their rotation properly, or someone's AFK, who knows. But that's the basic idea. Now, there are a lot of tips I can give about the specifics of how to do certain pulls or specific rooms, but the key points are to learn how spearmen, monks, archers, and knights behave. More info on this in the text version of the guide also. Now let me talk about the air compressor. There are a few reasons why I prefer snare charge instead, and let me address the counter arguments, but don't get me wrong, I think air compressor is really good. Air compressor is really useful, especially if there are stray drones or in certain pools that make it very simple to just walk in and air compress the mobs. Now, while it's convenient, let me tell you, there isn't a single pull in the Avalonian dungeons that you cannot do without it. The one thing I'm not sure about though is whether or not it's worth having one of the arcanes go mimic and copying snare charge from the mace, and then you can go air compressor and snare charge. This is most likely the best setup to have. Even though you lose one of the frazzles, I think it's worth the utility because you shouldn't be having issues with the mob clearing aspect anyway. Now, snare charge I think is really useful when there are melee mobs in the pool, especially monks, as they will simply walk out and start smacking people during the silence, and then you risk them declumping or murdering people. So that is the main reason for it. There is very few pulls I ask the off tank to swap to air compress. And usually the time spent walking towards the next pull, they have cooldowns back up anyway, so that's another alternative if you have an experienced group. You can simply say, after the pull, swap to air compress. And by the time your party has done looting and walked towards the next pull and your Great Arcane is ready, you won't have problems with waiting for cooldowns. But yeah, air compressor is really nice. I definitely suggest doing an hour or two without it though, and see if you're still capable of getting good clumps without relying on it. If you're going with an unexperienced group and you have trouble getting clumps together, then definitely go with air compressor. Now, specifically about the composition in general, you will notice that we don't have much melee DPS, whether it's the supportive types like Carving Sword, or the damage types like Bear Paws or Spirit Hunter. Now, don't get me wrong, these builds are really good for mob clearing. Well, I personally think Carving is just subpar, but it's decent for mob clearing. The two main reasons I don't include them is because number one, they are straight up garbage for bosses, and number two, having additional melees mess with the strategy when doing Basilisk and Bedivere. The first thing that might come to mind is, well, then just bring a ranged DPS swap like a bow and a royal jacket, which is fine. I try to avoid swap though in general, but that is absolutely fine if you do bring a single target ranged DPS swap. So in that case, there's nothing wrong with that, but I just decide to not include it in the comp. Otherwise, what else is there to mention? You have all the tools needed to easily deal with all the mob packs. 3 iron roots make it so you'll breeze through all pulls. You have a lot of damage, you have a lot of buffs, a lot of resistance shreds. If people are pulling their weight, you will have absolutely zero issues. Now, this composition has been designed with prioritizing bosses. As you've now noticed, because the bosses is where you will run into issues. Once again, there are a lot of different ways to do this. There are royal helmet variants I've seen. There are a lot of ways to do this and a lot of ways to do the stun rotation. Once again, this is the way I'm comfortable with and have done things for a long time. So I was thinking, what is a good way to teach how to do pulls? And I thought the best way would be by using the example for the final boss connector, which you will run into every single Avalonian dungeon you will do. So it's worth knowing this one for sure. I highly recommend reading the text version, by the way, which covers the general tips and tricks for this. The first pack you'll run into is 2 wizards and a warrior. Pull is very easy. Have the incubus tank walk off to the side, poison or taunt, and walk off while you place an inertia ring to catch the mobs clumping, and then you just Grey Arcane. Pretty easy. Now the next pull is the one with 4 monks on the bridge. For this one, you can just walk through the middle until you have aggro on all 4 monks. Then walk off to the side and then walk backwards. Now you need to make sure you time the soldier helmet to not get knocked by the spearmen because they will do their AoE attacks. Place an inertia ring and the 4 monks will clump very hard all on top of each other. Although, arguably, you don't want them to clump completely, since it is a little tricky to link the proper ones with the iron roots, if they're clumping right on top of each other. But yeah, a little tricky. But if you get the soldier helmet timing down, it's pretty easy. After pull is over, you can have your incubus tank swap to air compressor, and then we have the next pull. You want to use your boots, walk in between all the 5 mobs, and then air compressor and Great Arcane instantly as soon as the animation goes off, and you will have a good clump. Next, pick one of the stairs. Simply pull one of the archers to the side, and they will clump. You don't even need a nurturing for this one. As I mentioned earlier, there are archers in this pull, so remind your healers to not cast stuff until the mobs are hit by the Great Arcane, or else they will do their silence shot. There are a lot of rooms and different pulls, but the general idea is the same. You want to pull the mobs, have them clump on the inertia ring, and then hit them with the Great Arcane. Works for almost every single pull. In other tricky cases, you have to do some funky stuff if you're not doing it with air compress. But the only times pulls get complicated are when you have monks, spearmen, and knights, as then you have to take into account their animations and stuff. We don't have time in this video to go over all the pulls, but if there's any connector you should memorize, it's this one, the final boss connector, because as I said, it shows up in literally every Ava you will ever do, so it's worthwhile knowing and mastering. One mob I will mention specifically is the Avalonian Winged Guard, which starts casting near immediately when pulled and is basically immune to CC. Luckily, the pulls in which these appear are usually reasonably easy, so you can just dodge the wind walls and focus on not messing up the sun rotation. One thing you can do to make it easier with regards to the bird is that which directions the wind walls shoot out in are dependent on which way you face it. So if you hold aggro and change the position it's facing, from my understanding, you can make it easier for your party to not have to dance around too much. Now, another tip is that you can get a few seconds extra CC on the bird. You can Great Arcane this thing once and then that's it. So you want to make sure to land the E on it right after it's done its 2 auto attacks right before it's about to cast. This way you maximize the downtime of the wind walls and make it easier for the party to focus on DPSing it down. It goes without saying, don't be a dum-dum and keep bumping into the wind wall, but walk around in between the gaps. Be careful if you're melee, as the visual indicators of the wind wall casts are sometimes a little off as the bird is casting. Honestly though, the pulls you will get the hang of it and perhaps come up with even better ways to do them yourself until one day we'll have the optimal positions and methods for every single pull. But we'll move on from this topic now and focus on the bosses. Once again, if you're interested, I do have although very incomplete list of different pulls and connectors. If you're interested in checking those out, then it's in the text written guide, which obviously is in the description below. All right, so we covered the mob clearing part. Now let's go on to the tough part, which is the bosses. But before we get into the specifics of each boss, I will mention that depending on how experienced your party is, I recommend having 1 or 2 reawakens on certain bosses if you know you'll have issues. If you don't think you'll have any issues, then have the Iron Root support swap to bow and just kill the boss faster. I will also suggest one of the crossbow DPSs to swap to Sunder under W. It will be slightly lower DPS for that specific person, but it will benefit the party and result in a faster kill time overall, so I think it's worth it. In general, bosses are pretty tricky if you don't have the correct setup, so I suggest you really study these. Let's start off with not necessarily the easiest boss, but the most simple boss. The Archmage is genuinely one of the easiest bosses because, quite frankly, there are no mechanics. There is only AoE to dodge, so even if you go in blind, if you just dodge the AoEs, you can breeze through this boss. The boss alternates between two phases, which both get increasingly harder as the boss's HP gets lower, but that's about it. The boss will keep doing these two phases until it dies. The first phase consists of an enclosing circle, battle royale style, that keeps shrinking inwards and leaving you with less room to work with until it gets small, then it disappears, and then the second phase begins. During the first phase, the boss will try to murder you with a plethora of abilities such as Double Laser, Disintegrate, Skybeam, and Disruptive Energy. Once you understand how these abilities work and roughly the way the boss casts them, you'll be fine. First, the boss will keep casting Skybeams, a small AoE that appears and increases in frequency as her HP gets lower. She also casts these during the second phase, by the way. Next, we got Disintegrate, which is the beam. The boss will target whoever is aggro on her and will beam that person and keep channeling damage to that person. On top of that, it deals splash damage to anyone near that person, so that would obviously be the tank. So beware of your positioning. If there is little room to work with, you should pop your boots or soldier helmet and briefly leave the area to not wipe people near you. For this, I recommend to mark your tank to make it easier for people to see where the beam is. Next, we got Disruptive Energy. Is this ball or cloud of light / smoke thing, the little ball. It flies around and bounces away people, often into AoEs. So, at the start of the fight, you only have one of these, but as her HP drops, she spawns up to 3, so it will be more difficult. Prioritize not getting bounced by these. And next, for the Double Laser, her signature move is honestly very easy to dodge and avoid damage. Keep in mind one thing, that she has the Robe of Purity effect while casting this, so you'll get knocked away. If you're melee, never stand on top of her, as she will bounce you off and you will probably get hit by the laser or other stuff while in midair. A few tips on avoiding the laser damage, because there might be a time where it will be impossible to dodge due to avoiding the disruptive energy, for example. If you cannot avoid the damage, try to walk the opposite way of where the laser is going. Don't walk along the laser, as you will spend more time in it and you will take more damage. As soon as the enclosing circle disappears, the boss will do a small burst AoE around her, and afterwards the second phase will begin. There are 2 easy variants, which happens when the boss has more than 50% HP, and then you have the hard variant of the second phase, when that is the 2 easy phases combined, the 2 easy versions combined, which occurs when the boss has below 50% HP. Keep in mind the frequency of the sky beams increases as our HP drops. Now, the biggest tip I can give anyone for not dying during this phase is to walk towards the boss as soon as the burst AoE is over. No matter where the lines or the AoEs spawn, you always have enough time to react, even without any roll or blink shoes. Obviously, if you're lagging, then that's not the case, but just by walking, you can dodge literally all the AoEs. But if you're newer to avas, then obviously roll shoes swap is a good idea for this boss until you get the hang of it. Alright, well, that's basically it for the mechanics. Now, how do you beat this boss, you might be asking? What I recommend is cycling 2 damage reductions for each double laser she does, basically. And if you do it correctly, you should be able to have it up for almost every single one, depending how many disintegrates she does. But even then, if one of the lasers isn't reduced, it's not that big of a deal. Just if you announce it in advance, then people can prepare for it. You cycle the damage reduction, Black Monk E and Feeble Aura Forceful Swing, and make sure you do this slightly in advance for the Black Monk to get the stacks. Then call for the other damage reduction after she's done one auto attack, more than enough time to get the stacks and to enfeeble slightly in advance. This will help a lot with the people in your party who are attracted to the red AoEs. No, but seriously, it will help a lot in case you have people who are inexperienced. I 100% recommend all the healers to swap to your Awaken unless you have absolute trust in your party that not a single person will die. There's a cheese method during the second phase where you can run out of the boss room and just sit on the edge and basically avoid the second phase altogether. But once again, for a faster clear time, I recommend to actually learn how to dodge and keep DPSing because it's honestly not that difficult. It's unless you're super hard lagging, it is very simple. Make sure the tank doesn't leave though, because you will leash. But yeah, honestly, not that many mechanics for this boss. Just cycle the damage reduction, have reawakens, dodge the AoE, and the boss will die. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Next, we got the boss that many consider to be the most difficult one. In fact, and for a good reason, because it has some tricky mechanics and the positioning needs to be on point if you want to do it the optimal way. Even the Avalonian Discord has stopped running out of the room, so I will not suggest that method even for inexperienced groups. Alright, so the first thing about this boss is actually the positioning, which as you can see by this beautiful drawing on the screen, this is roughly how you want to position for the second phase. I suggest having the Iron Root go for the Fallen for this boss, as it will help a lot with the healing output and if someone is a reawaken. Okay, so this boss has two phases. The first phase is very simple. If you have roll shoes, you can simply roll the wind wall. Don't walk behind the boss. Don't walk in front to avoid the AoEs. If you are experienced, you can walk around the wind wall through the front of the boss before the AoE hit you. Even without any movement speed, this is doable if you are experienced. This is doable, but a little tricky. The optimal way is to, during the first phase, just clump near the front, right outside the range of the AoEs, and when the wind wall channel comes, just walk around through the front. And that's pretty much it for the first phase, to be honest. Don't walk behind the boss, avoid the wind wall, and that's it. Now, the beauty of this boss starts when you enter the second phase, which is where you will actually run into issues. That's where you want to get into this formation on the picture, this amazing drawing. Shout out to Paint, by the way. So the boss will have a certain rotation now because SBI keeps fucking up the game. Every patch, the boss might be bug free and sometimes the rotation might be off. I'll explain in a moment just what I mean by that. So normally the second phase starts with a long channel. At the end of the channel will be a small pause. The boss will zap five nearby players and then do a big burst AoE to everyone. And then one random player will receive the boss cleanse. The boss will then do a stun AoE in a cone shape in front of him. Then the boss will do a spray AoE in front of him, going left to right, back to middle. And then the boss will do two auto attacks, and then the boss will zap and do another AoE and give another random player a boss cleanse. Then a cone stun, a spray, and soon enough this will repeat itself. I don't remember the exact time, but this is on a roughly 45 to 50 second timer, I think. So this just keeps repeating itself until the boss dies. Now, every time the boss does the big burst AoE, he will also gain one stack of resistances, divine scales, that make him harder to kill. So the longer you drag it out, the more tanky he gets. Now let's cover some of the mechanics and how we handle this boss, and that will hopefully cover why we have the specific positioning setup. So first of all, throughout the whole boss fight, nobody should ever walk behind the boss because it will slam its tail on you. That's for both phases, by the way. Now, whenever the boss auto-attacks the tank, it applies one stack of a resistance debuff, and you can only cleanse it with the boss cleanse, not a regular cleanse. Whichever 5 people get zapped by the boss will get 1 stack each of Divine Pulse, which increases damage dealt by 20% per stack, but also damage received by 20% per stack. So it's a double-edged sword. On top of that, it deals a damage in a small circle around you to you and your allies. The radius of this circle increases the more stacks you have. Once again, the only way to cleanse this is to either run out of the boss room completely or to get the boss cleanse. As for the big damage bursts, which I'll just call the first nuke for the first one, that's channeled and telegraphed. And the second one, I will call the second nuke, which there is no channel for. It is crucial that you apply damage reduction for both nukes, otherwise it will chunk you for a lot. So assign one black monk for the first nuke, and then the other black monk for the second nuke, so you'll always have the damage reduction. I suggest also saving Incubus E for the first nuke, and if you have it up for the second one, like with a Royal Jacket or something, then that's perfect. Otherwise, just save it and only use it for the nukes. So the reason we run Cleanse and a Merc Hood on top is because as soon as one of the nukes hits, someone will have the boss cleanse on them. This looks like the Purge AoE that the Acolytes cast actually, so you might recognize it. Now, you run it on top of the Incubus tank, and any non-DPS that gets a stack of Divine Pulse should clump on top of the tank, get hit by the Cone Stun AoE on purpose, which will be then cleansed by the Mercenary Hood. Now, if you are 100% confident in your group, as the W on cleanse, the W cleanse on the Arcane is just insurance. If you think you don't need it, then you can simply swap to Frazzle and kill the boss faster. But I recommend the insurance, as one person getting caught not getting the cleanse is a big pain in the ass. This has the benefit of cleansing the tank as well from the Corrosive Breath stacks, which reduce the resistances if people clump on top of the tank, because then the boss can always get the boss cleanse. The tank can always get the boss cleanse rather, which is good, makes it easier for the main healer to keep the tank alive. Now, all of the DPS who get stacks need to make sure they are positioned appropriately and that they actually make use of the buff and deal as much damage as possible. You want to make the most out of this plus 20% damage buff because it's kind of big, and you have 2 stacks, then it's plus 40% damage. So unlike some people who think this is bad, just take advantage of this double-edged sword and kill the boss faster with your damage buffs. Now, the group healers honestly should be pretty far away. That's why you can see on this drawing. You almost guarantee never getting a Divine Pulse stack, which is good. You don't risk giving the tank healing sickness. You should be far away. You give people more room, so just stay there in the back, let the DPS be spread and do their damage. This is one of the reasons why you should limit the amount of melee DPS, by the way, because if you honestly have more than 4, they will clump and chunk each other if they gain stacks. With this easy setup, you can have 2 melees on each side, 2 Black Monks, 1 Spectre, and 1 Realm Breaker. Honestly, it's just keep spread, especially if you see someone who has stacks. Make sure your DPS isn't sleeping, so if they do get the boss cleanse, they actually bring it to the Incubus tank so people can get rid of their stacks if they're not DPS. Alright, so before I get into some specific tips, I want to quickly mention what I was talking about earlier with regards to SBI scuffing this boss, and most bosses actually. Since a few updates ago, this boss doesn't always do his second phase in the same order. He sometimes does the spray first, he sometimes does the auto attacks first, so it might be a little tricky, but it is still the same amount of time since the first nuke to that when he will do the second nuke. The timer is the exact same, but just his ability stuff is out of order. Usually after one rotation it seems to fix itself, but not always the case, so keep that in mind. If the boss does the spray AoE first, then obviously don't clump on the tank and die the AoE, because it will one-shot you if it's not damage reduced. And the big issue is sometimes this boss is desynced to the point where the Divine Pulse damage will come in right as the cleanse drops, which it never used to be like that, and it doesn't really make sense for it to be like that, because if you're clumping to grab the cleanse to get rid of the stacks, but then you get punished because you're trying to clump and grab the cleanse, it doesn't really make sense, but that's for SBA to fix. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the boss. Just manage the stacks, kill the boss fast, don't clump, and don't chunk yourself with the pulse stacks. If you're not a DPS, grab the boss cleanse if needed. If you get the boss cleanse on you, bring it on top of the Incubus tank. Unless it's a spray AoE, then obviously don't. Keep DPSing, healers keep healing. One thing, actually, the nukes do in fact cancel ability casts, so don't drop a fallen E or a big E or anything interruptible like that. If you have stacks, then especially don't walk on top of other people because you're just trolling the group. Keep the group formation positioning that I put on the drawing here and you will be fine. It is a little tricky, but after a few attempts you'll get the hang of it and it's pretty simple. Just before we get into the next boss, in the description below you can find a 26-minute video of me going over how to tank this boss, and it has tips in general. So if you have issues tanking this boss and keeping it in one place rather, I recommend you watch it. Next we got the Construct, one of the easier bosses for sure if you know what you're doing, and here I'll mention the optimal way to kill this boss. 100% have the Iron Root support whip out a bow for this one, as you won't need an extra fallen. As for all bosses, have one of the crossbows swap to Sunder on their W, and also have one of your Frost DPS swap to Frost Beam on their W. This is only for this boss, and I recommend only one Frost Beam. That Frost user should Frost Beam off cooldown on the boss. The reason why is every time the boss lands an auto attack, he gains a stack of a buff, so we want to make sure to slow his ramp up time. For sure, have the 2 Black Monks use Forceful Swing, as this is pretty big in terms of slowing his ramp up time. Alright, so how does this boss work? You lead him to a corner where you can easily just sit and tank him without having to move. After a moment, the boss will do a red eye channel, and anyone who is not standing still by the end of the channel, the boss will throw a lightning circle on top of them, and he'll also lose 1 stack of compensator energy status per AoE thrown. So during the first phase, he only has 5 of these stacks. So what I like to do is pick 5 people in advance, which are usually the people who have Royal Shoes. So I picked the 2 group healers, the Iron Root support, the Great Arcane support, which is on Black Monk for the boss, of course, and the Shadow Color support. These 5 people usually have Roll Shoes anyway. Even if you don't have Roll Shoes, just go Refreshing Sprint and you'll be fine. So when the boss does his thing, have people run off in predetermined direction that you agreed on in advance, run away from the boss, while everyone else stands still and doesn't move. Please don't move, please. They walk off, these 5 people, they spin in circles on purpose to make sure they are moving by the end of the channel, so the boss actually throws the AoE. And as soon as the AoE lands, they roll out. Autobots roll out. No, but make sure the AoE actually lands, because it is a projectile, so there is a travel time to take into account. Now, to make sure these 5 people don't get brutally murdered, do your damage reduction and optionally throw in an Incubus E. And even if they were just to walk out, they will most likely survive. Now, the reason for this is when he loses all of his stacks, it not only slows his ramp up time of a different stack. This guy has a lot of stacks, by the way. It slows him down, and it will make it easier later in terms of the stacks. Either way, he becomes vulnerable for 6 or 8 seconds, I don't remember, and you will deal plus 50% damage to him during this time. So it's pretty good, and also less compensator stacks. He has less zap AoE damage, which if he has 0 stacks, he will do 0 AoE damage, so it's pretty good. Okay, so you keep this up until the second phase, where you'll notice he gains 10 compensator stacks instead of 5, and you usually just keep doing the same thing. You have 5 people run out and roll shoes out after the AoEs land. Still, do make sure you damage reduce the boss, of course. Now, the tricky thing is during the second phase, the boss will chunk you for a lot, so have the second Black Monk drop the damage reduction as soon as they are back, then cycle as many as you can, but obviously make sure you save 1 damage reduction for the lightning circles. This is the time where you can call the resets. Don't just drop it randomly. If nobody's below half HP, then just use your Holy Orb and Q people. But yeah, make sure both Fallens don't drop at the same time. If you need 1 reset, then I recommend just having the raid leader call it the reset. Even in an 8-3, you'll be fine. One could argue why not have 10 people run out, which would obviously be good, but from my experience, it's not only a pain in the ass to have 10 people do it, especially since they might not all have roll shoes, but it's definitely doable, especially if you slap on the second group of DPS and use an enigmatic, for example. But there will be a lot of AoEs. But if you're going with an inexperienced group, then I would suggest just go with 5. It is pretty tricky to pull off, but you have healers anyway. It's arguable whether it's worth it or not to send half your DPS away for more than 6 seconds to get a plus 50% damage buff for everyone, since you might have as well just stayed and dealt that damage. I haven't done the exact math and timing, and it's, it's not quite that easy as just adding the numbers there. But due to how tricky it is probably close enough where you might as well just take the safe route and just do the damage reduction, since you already have it and you can just heal through it since you already have healers. Not 100% sure, but once again, if you're with a new group, don't bother. Just have the same 5 people run out. Stick to that during the second phase as well. Either way, a pretty easy boss. If you for some reason have too many stacks on the boss and need to move it, then do it right after a lightning circle. Keep in mind the laser beam he shoots out when you move it. I suggest just moving the boss to a different closest corner, and that should rid it of all, if most, if not all, of the stacks. And just watch out for the rocks that the boss will throw as he walks. But yeah, pretty simple boss. Just make sure to frost beam off cooldown and forceful swing, and yeah, you'll be fine. And next is a pretty weird boss, High Priestess. This boss has been bugged since release. It has not worked properly once since release. I know this is a rant, but this boss is genuinely so bugged that it is not even worth trying to do it the intended way. So I will first show you the easy way to one-shot the boss, very simple. Have the Incubus tank swap to Snare Charge, Hammer tank swap to Taunt and Threat Gen, clump up everyone, aggro the boss, cleanse away when your party gets CC'd at the start, then find the yellow circle, everyone walks inside, the tank snare charges the mobs as they appear, he runs out of the room, while the hammer tank holds aggro of the boss. The mobs kill themselves, the Incubus tank returns, and if the boss is still alive, then you repeat the process. Sometimes the boss will do a big burst AoE. If that's the case, then just cleanse everyone, drop a reset, drop Judy Armor, Enigmatic E, and you'll be fine. Now, there's more than one way to one-shot the boss, but basically this is the easiest way. I know it's retarded, but it works. Alright, so I was wondering whether or not it was even worth putting the intended way to kill this boss, because it's so bugged and God knows what they will change about the boss if they ever do end up fixing her. They will probably rework her a lot. So I will just briefly cover it. The basic idea is that if you are not standing in the circle, your healing output is basically zero. So the healers need to stand inside these divine offerings, as they're called. Now, start off by having everyone clump up. As she spawns less shadows, the less people are in the divine offering. And also the less people are in it, the stronger the boss is, and she will lifesteal with her auto attacks. So have everyone walk inside. Have the Realm Breaker on Taunt and Threat Gen. You'll see why in a sec. While the Incubus tank just tanks the main boss as any other boss, the Hammer tank, as always, swaps to Black Monk, and then you and the Arcanes go on a journey, while you three kite the group of fangirls trying to get an autograph. And while you kite this group, the Realm Breaker will taunt off one shadow at a time. They get bursted down, and you keep this up until they are all dead. And then you clump up in the yellow circle again, because SBI is trolling, you sometimes don't even get the PvE fame, even when doing this boss properly. And recently, as all bosses have gotten desynced, as I mentioned, she sometimes does the burst AoE randomly, even while shadows are still alive, which is pretty messed up. So I suggest just do the cheese one-shot method rather than having to deal with this spaghetti code. And yeah, the mobs heal for a metric fuck ton while they are linked together. So no purge, no healing reduction works, but maybe we'll see with the new Dagger W that's on the A. Maybe that will actually somehow go through. I don't know. But yeah, you can't locus, you can't healing reduction. You actually have to pick them off one at a time. So the Realm Breaker, just keep taunting and killing them one at a time. And it's actually reasonably easy. If it's not bugged, that is. Do make sure to drive by the healing circle to get some heals if you need. The group healers will be prioritizing killing the Arcanes and Hammer tank, as they will be kiting the groupies, which do a lot of damage. It's a pretty retarded boss just because of all the bugs, but just cheese it until SBI actually decides to fix it. Been over a year now, and after 3 attempts of fixing it, trying to patch her, even one whole rework, every single attempt just made it easier to one-shot the boss. So yeah, bug fix waiting room is all I'm gonna say. Taunt that one. Alright guys, I want you to get ready. Once you guys, everyone go inside the healing circle now. Sanabisco, just you should, yeah, just be a little bit away from it so he doesn't drop the AoE. Yeah, like that. Guys, once that one dies, save your Merc Hood, your resets, your Enigmatics, everything, okay? Sanabisco, you can go inside the circle. Guys, get ready for she's gonna do a big nuke here in a sec once that mob dies, okay? Now, cleanse and Enigmatic. Healers go inside that fucking circle.
Circle moved. We need to get in there.
Oh no.
Everyone go inside the circle, drop a reset. Everyone in the circle.
Oh my god.
Why did she not take damage? At least this boss is bugged.
Oh god.
Next, we got Knight Captain, another simple boss. There's one cheese method where you can just have him stand behind the chest and have the two tanks alternate grabbing the buff from the middle, but this is obviously not intended as you skip basically every single mechanic of the boss. But knowing SBI, they won't fix it, so if you want to an AFK braindead method, this is it. As for the mechanics, it's a pretty fun boss, but needs to be buffed in my opinion as he's way too weak. Have the Incubus tank drink the Shrine, as you will get one shot if you don't. He has two phases. The first one is really simple. The big mechanic to watch out for is his Reflective Shield, which deals damage to you whenever you hit him, when he has the shield up, if you are facing the shield, that is. Watch out for the visual bugs, however. Here's another shitty drawing. During the second phase, he has an ability where he will jump and slam on someone. He will usually do the Reflective Shield shortly after, so the tank needs to be quick to reposition him away from the party, wherever that is. I just like to have him jump between spot 1 and spot 2, as you can see. Just call the direction and people will know where is safe to DPS from and where they should position. He has another ability where he does a long channel, deals a lot of damage to everyone. He gains 1 stack of a buff that makes him faster and makes him attack faster. So he has some scaling going on there, but this is barely noticeable as he dies pretty quickly, to be honest. And as always, you can cycle damage reductions, but save at least 1 for the big burst if you're in the second phase. A cool thing is if you're not in his line of sight at the end of the channel, he will not deal damage to you. And I think just because this boss is so easy, they should make this deal true damage to actually force you to play around the mechanics and not just brute force damage reduced it. Yeah, honestly, pretty easy boss as long as you don't kill yourself on the reflect. There should be 0 issues. And that brings us to the final boss, Sir Bedivere, which always shows up as the final boss, so you have to know this one for sure if you're going to be doing avas. Honestly, pretty simple if you have the correct setup, which we do. So here we have another amazing drawing. Take a look and you will see we have 4 different groups, 1 guarding helmet each, put 5 at most in each group. Melees at the front group, and the point of this is that you want a guarding helmet off cooldown, because the boss applies a stack of a debuff called Fate of the Unworthy, which deals damage to you every 2 seconds, and the way around this is to either run away from the boss or to have a guarding helmet. So the optimal way is to have a few guarding helmets, use them off cooldown, and you're good. Now the boss has an ability which is similar to that of the Knight, Bladestorm, where you will see a red circle on the ground which will turn into swords. They will spin, stop, and then shoot outwards and knock down anyone hit. Very easy to dodge these though, so you're fine. Make sure to never walk in front of the boss because his auto attacks are a very wide cleave attack and it hurts, as you can see in the picture. When the boss reaches 50% of his HP, he pulls an anime protagonist or villain move and heals back up. Grows his arm back in some weird phantom form, and then the second phase begins. Now, keep in mind, you can healing reduction this healing up to a point, so having a demonic and Hood of Tenacity swap is nice to have, and you will save some time killing this boss. As for the second phase, he still applies stacks of Faith of the Unworthy, so keep using guarding helmets off cooldown. He will have more blades in his Bladestorm ability, making it a little trickier to dodge, but it's still very doable. He gains 2 new abilities. One is a knockback near him, followed by a 3-way reflective shield that spins around him. This is just like for Knight Captain though. As long as you're not in the red AoE, you can DPS freely. Otherwise, just wait it out or reset your stacks or whatever. Make sure to not tunnel vision though, and walk in front of the boss as you're walking along this line that's circling around him. Keep in mind, this AoE doesn't deal damage. It's just a reflective shield. You don't actually have to hit the boss. And then his last ability is called Grasp of the Undying, which he first chokes one player, CC locks them, they are lifted into the air, and they take a lot of damage. Now, luckily, we have an Enigmatic to basically counter this ability. If the Enigmatic user gets beamed, then you have a Clerical just for this boss. For high tier dungeon runs, though, you actually benefit from having a reasonably high tier Enigmatic staff. Because the damage is pretty big, so don't just bring like a flat 5 to a high tier Ava. Either way, he ramps up a little bit as his HP drops during the second phase. He will cast Blade Storm more frequently as he approaches his death, so watch out for that. Other than that, it's pretty simple. Try to not waste your heal resets. Save it after the Blade Storms because they seem to have a weird attraction to always appearing whenever a Fallen E is used. So just hold it after a Blade Storm is down, drop a reset. You can call it so you don't all the healers don't drop it at the same time. Now the 4 groups should be far apart enough, so if a Blade Storm appears on one of the groups, only that particular group has to break formation, while the other groups can chill as they are. Obviously, you can move a tiny bit just to dodge the swords that shoot out, but yeah. Guardian Helmet off cooldown, cycle the damage reduction. If you're a tank, avoid the Earthbreaker, the big sword slam AoE. And just like that, keep DPSing, the boss will die eventually. And honestly, that's it. As you can tell, this video was somewhat rushed, so I might have forgotten or missed a thing or two. And the production quality isn't as high as I would like it to be, but I wanted to get this video out before I took a break from Albion. And it is a very long video, and there's a lot of stuff to cover, so I'm 100% sure I missed something, but if anything, there's always a text guide. So, although not finished, mostly do some ability names being off, and in a while, perhaps the builds will be off due to balance changes or reworks or whatever. Also, the pull list is incomplete, but it's still a really good resource, I think. I'm obviously biased though as I made it, but either way, I really hope this long-ass video was useful. Hope you learned something, and leave a like if you enjoyed, and I hope you have a good one.